Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over Chapter 12 in the Public Speaking Project textbook on delivering your speech. So this chapter covers tips on how the delivery aspect. So if you've already created your speech, you have what you say down, how do you deliver it well and effectively to convey your main points to your audience? So you can see in the chapter overview, we'll talk about different methods of delivery, the vocal aspects of delivery, nonverbal aspects of delivery, mastering the location, preparation, practice, and delivery, and we'll go over a little conclusion as well. So the introduction talks about that, you can put a lot of effort into kind of writing your speech, getting the content down, doing a lot of research, but it's really that delivery which is going to have a huge impact um, on the audience. And so, is the speech going to be effective? Will the audience stay alert and follow the speech? Will the audience properly interpret the speaker's intended message? So, really thinking about how you're going to deliver it in order for the audience to take in the information that you want to share. Here's a quote from Rolf Martson. Don't lower your expectations to meet your performance. Raise your performance to meet your expectation. Expect the best of yourself and then do what is necessary to make it reality. And often that is practicing. I know when I first started giving speeches in school, I was very nervous. I skipped one speech when I was supposed to do in high school just because I was too nervous to give it. But the more practice you get giving speeches, the better you get at it. And the more comfortable you get, and the more effective your delivery is. And I really think that comfort and confidence are some key points in being able to give an effective speech. And even if you're not confident, even if you're not comfortable, it's getting out there and practicing, which is going to get you there. So continue practicing as much as you can. Anytime you can get yourself in front of an audience, that's what makes you more comfortable. So I always say that I used to hate giving speeches, and now I'm comfortable with it. Right, and comfortable teaching. I'm comfortable going in different public venues and giving speeches. I've come a long way, and so that's why I always work when I work with students. I'll let them know, hey, you can be successful too. If I could be, a lot of anxiety, speech anxiety, where I even did do one speech, I was able to get there. So this next part goes over methods of delivery, and there are different methods that you can use to deliver a speech. The first here is the manuscript style. Sometimes students will turn in an essay and think that's, here's my speech. And it's like, that's not a speech, that's an essay, right? A manuscript style speech is writing out the speech, but we speak differently than we talk. And so if you're doing a manuscript style, there are people who kind of specialize in writing the way that people talk. So it sounds a little bit more natural. So manuscript styles most often used with newscasters and television personalities who, maybe just presenting the news and want exactly accurate information. They used to have paper scrolls that would roll, and then the words would come on the screen. There's kind of teleprompters that are used now, so the newscaster is looking at the lens and reading through what's said. Sometimes on Saturday Night Live, if you watch that, they have big kind of cue cards with it written out. Kind of do it more an old-fashioned way. So it is commonly used in the media. That's when manuscript style is most often used. There's also manuscript deliveries done by politicians, so presidents, or sometimes other people of high offices may have their speech written out in a manuscript that they're presenting. So it's that's a teleprompter. So often, if you're going into politics, if you're going into mass media, being a newscaster, so really that television personality, those are when you would use manuscript style deliveries. Often in my public speaking class, I'm not training students to be newscasters. I'm not training them to be presidential candidates. So we don't use a manuscript style delivery, but sometimes it is used. In my personal life, I've used more of a manuscript when I officiated a wedding. Also, like giving a eulogy at a funeral, some of those special occasion speeches where I may plan out more my exact words and what I want to say. And part of that is just to, with giving a wedding kind of, doing a wedding ceremony, I want to make sure I'm fulfilling the legal requirements of what needs to be said in a wedding, but also just going over with a couple beforehand to make sure everything, fits with what they're looking for, their expectations. So that's when I've used a manuscript in weddings and funerals, those special occasions. But often that's not what I prefer to use at all, and not what I suggest students to do, unless, again, you're taking a mass media class, you may want to use manuscript delivery. The second part is a memorized style. I also don't encourage my students to do this in my public speaking classes because this is a lot of work. So if you're doing competitive speech and debate, that's when you'll use the memorized style, where you're going to commit the speech to memory. You're going to know all the words you're going to say, and the speech and debate folks, they also know how they're going to say each of the words. So back when elocution was taught and was how they taught public speaking, this is what we used to be taught very commonly. So the Optimist Club, I used to be a president of Optimist Club chapter. So they have speech competitions, oratory contests for high school students in order to get scholarships. So again, you have to memorize the speech and deliver it well. So it does want it to be accurate in those situations. So yeah, speech competitions is more often where the memorized style is going to be used. They also in acting, so in theater, so actors on stage. If it's a public theater, often they're going to memorize the script and perform it verbatim. So they're going to memorize every single word. That sounds like a lot of work. It is a lot of work, right? It's a lot of practice. So it's not something I've ever done. I've never done a memorized speech. I haven't participated in speech and debate. I've done some theater, but behind the scenes theater is more my area of interest. But definitely you can do a memorized style in those situations. So again, not necessarily what you do use in a public speaking classroom, but it's definitely used in our society. Next is impromptu speaking. So impromptu means made up on the spot, unprepared, unrehearsed. Sometimes I'll do this in my classrooms, especially when I'm teaching in person, just as an exercise. So you may give a ceremonial toast, you may say grace before meals. Sometimes that can be a memorized one though. Just giving someone an acknowledgement, an introduction, offering things, and so on. Those are the sort of things where you'd use impromptu. I use it to help my students get comfortable. I'll give them just prompts in my classroom. Doesn't work as well in an online classroom, but in an in-person classroom, because online classroom, unless you're live with them, a synchronous online classroom, you're not going to have them, the prompts very much, you're given the prompt and you start speaking, right? You may have a couple of seconds to prepare, or just to ground yourself and figure out where you're going to, but just whatever words are coming out of your mouth. And so, yeah, so that's some examples of impromptu speeches. Extemporaneous speech. This is what I tell public speaking students to use. Extemporaneous style speeches is very common in a public speaking classroom. When I'm professionally giving presentations, whether it's an academic conference, whether it is to a group of community members, I use more of this extemporaneous style. So extemporaneous is sandwiched between the memorized and impromptu delivery styles. It's really about speech isn't completely written out. You have an outline. You have some keynotes for reference. You kind of know what you're going to say. You've done your research. You know what you're talking about. But it's, again, you don't know the exact words. You haven't planned it down word for word. You don't know exactly how things are going to set this chapters in delivery. Like, how are you going to say those words too? It's really keeping yourself in the moment and engage with that audience. And I think that's very good not to be too rehearsed. It can be responsive to the audience as well. Sometimes students, they're using extemporaneous style in my classroom, but they're so focused on what they're going to say, they'll like ask a question as the attention getter, which is a common and good attention getter, and then the audience doesn't respond the way they were expecting or anticipated, and so that then it's hard for them to, if they're not extemporaneous enough and they're being more memorized, it's hard for them to respond or pivot. But if they're being extemporaneous and in the moment, you're able to kind of just really work with the audience and be there and be present. I've also, one of the good things about extemporaneous speaking, if you're giving multiple speeches back to back, like in a classroom, that's what we do. Often you could refer like, oh, the last speaker mentioned this as well, or a couple speakers ago, whatever it may be. And so I think that's also a cool thing about extemporaneous speaking. You can be really in the moment. You know what you're going to say. You have your research done, but you're just talking. It shows, to me, it shows a lot of confidence as well. It shows a lot of preparation that you put the work in, so you can just talk about it and feel like you're the expert of that topic and what you're gonna say. Whereas the memorized speaking, I mean, some of those you're reading off a teleprompter, you may not be that expert as much. And then it says here, one of the troubles is the trouble with talking too fast is you may something you haven't thought of yet. So that's one of the downsides of extemporaneous delivery, is because you may trip up or kind of lose your place or go off on a little tangent, and not stick to your script as much. Sometimes tangents are good, sometimes they're not as good. So I like the extemporaneous style. That's what I always recommend students use. It does say if you don't have a lot of formal speaking experience, it might be helpful to write out the speech as though it were an essay. But again, you're writing differently than you talk. It sounds awkward. You're pausing differently when you're reading, right? It's public speaking, not public reading. So I think that impacts the delivery. I mean, if you're just getting comfortable being in front of an audience and you're so nervous, like I could see it happening, but I don't encourage my students to do that at all. Um, just it really does impact the delivery in a negative way. You're more monotone when you're reading. Often, you're pausing differently, so it's harder for the audience to listen to it. So there's some issues there. So pivoting on vocal aspects to delivery. So how are we saying the words? Some of that nonverbal or kind of paralanguage. How we're using the words. So there's some key terms here. So articulations. Articulation is how we're saying the well. Do we correctly form our vowels and consonants? Sometimes you have to enunciate things well. Use proper dictation. I know sometimes I have a speech impediment, so growing up I had to work on my R's a lot, and so there's a couple other letters too that will trip me up. I also know when I'm saying things that sometimes I'll add a syllable to it, or not know how to pronounce it. If I learned a word by reading it, I won't pronounce it right, and it just makes you look not as intelligent or like you don't know what you're talking about. Right? I have a doctorate. I have 4 master's degrees. I'm confident in my intelligence, but I definitely do get tripped up with my language sometimes, and how I'm not saying things accurately, and it makes me look like I don't know what I'm talking about, and it impacts my credibility. Even though I tend to be, I like to think that I'm smart. Most people say that I'm smart and normally know what I'm talking about, but that can impact it if you're not pronouncing things correctly. So it talks about pronunciation here. Yeah, pronunciation is making sure you're saying the words correctly. If you're talking about a word that's from another country or different language or name you're not familiar with, it's good to look up the pronunciation beforehand before you give your speech, especially if it's a major word you plan on using. Because again, it's going to make you look like you don't know what you're talking about. But if you read it, right, we learn by reading quite a bit. If you're doing research for a speech, you're often learning by reading. So you have to look it up. You have to put in the effort to have it, heard, so you know how to pronounce it. Even though you know the word, that's why you're using the word, because you know it, because you probably read it somewhere. But it's still good to look up the pronunciation for words. There are different accents, dialects, regionalisms. So accents are just kind of the way we talk. I have a Minnesotan accent because I'm from Minnesota. Um, there's different dialects as well. So dialect is a variety of language where one is distinguished from others by grammar and vocabulary. So it gives an example here in Pennsylvania, you might hear people say that they're going to red up the room, which means to clean the room. I'm not from Pennsylvania, so I've never heard of red up the room. If you said that to me, I'd have no clue what you're talking about. So there's sometimes figures of speech, things that we say which make sense if you're talking to a common audience who knows that language. But it can seem odd if you're in a different audience or you're more, global audience or online audience where people may have a variety of ways that they talk, or a variety of expressions that they use that the audience may not be familiar with. So your accent, you can say things in different ways, but not necessarily saying. Talked about pronunciation before this, so sometimes, oh, you're not pronouncing that right, like caramel versus caramel, right? Those different ways to pronounce the same word. And if you have a different accent or a dialect that you're using, you may say things slightly differently, but that doesn't mean you're saying them wrong. So also just recognizing as a listener, sometimes some of those differences in speech are, shouldn't be held against their credibility. It's just that they're talking differently or talking with an accent. So if you're learning a second or a third or fourth language, you'll probably speak with some accent that the audience has to, get used to. So I've studied Spanish for many years, and I can understand Spanish to a good extent if it's spoken with an American accent. But if it's spoken with an accent as someone who actually speaks Spanish as their first language, often I can't understand what they're saying because the accent throws me off. Because a lot of my teachers who taught me Spanish were Americans with American accents. So again, those accents can be difficult to can just change the way we're comprehending something. And clearly, I'm not saying any of these Spanish words exactly right. I'm saying them with a Minnesotan accent, American accent. The people in Latin America are going to say I'm talking a little bit weird because I say things differently. There's also the vocal quality of the voice. So the sound, the texture. I have a deeper voice. Our voice can affect audibility and can affect the articulation as well. We each have a unique voice, but how we use our voice If we're in a large room without a microphone, you really have to enunciate and make sure people can hear you. Sometimes the rooms don't have good acoustics, so things are echoey and just hard to hear. I had once where I was listening to a speech and someone was speaking into a microphone, and the microphone was just not a good microphone, and it was impossible for me to understand them. It was just irritating on my ear, and I couldn't actually understand what they were saying. There's also the pitch and the inflection. So the pitch is the highness or lowness of the voice. We have different tones. So inflections are the turns and slides in the pitch to achieve meaning. So sometimes we'll change our pitch, like if we're asking a question. There's certain ways which we change our voice. If we're starting to speak faster as well, or slower, or we're pausing, right? That's part of that delivery too. Just the pauses are important, and giving people some time to take in the information. Whereas if we're just really yabbering on and talking quickly, sometimes when I'm nervous or excited, I talk quickly when giving a speech, and then people can't understand me as well. So certainly you can read through more here about different of those vocal variations that are used in a speech. I give some examples here. So people who do not use inflection are speaking in monotone, which is hard to listen to for a speech. Right, again, that's why if you're reading it, students who often read their speeches are speaking in monotone, and it's very obvious they're reading it even without looking at them, just the way they're talking. So it's good to have some vocal variation, and that's natural. So if you are planning on doing like a memorized speech, make sure, again, what sort of variation am I using? How am I going to say each of the words? How am I going to pronounce or convey my excitement or kind of the emotional appeal of the speech, whatever it may be. It may be excitement, it may be sadness, it may be seriousness, but how are you going to do that? I talked a little bit about the rate of speaking. Sometimes I get excited, talk faster. Sometimes we don't even know we're talking faster, and so it's good to record ourselves, because that's how I've learned to slow down, is by listening to recording myself. And it's like, oh my gosh, I can't understand that, right? And I'm the one who said it. I listened to the recording, and so it's like, okay, let me pause, let me slow down. I can take my time, and we can get this information conveyed, in a better way. So that rate of speaking is very important. There's pauses versus vocalized pauses. So filler words, ahs, like, right? Those can be very distracting for an audience. And what I've noticed is students each use different of those vocalized pauses, those filler words. And right there, I did one. If you're listening for them, you can hear them, and it can be very irritating. But some people, they're just very pronounced, and it makes it difficult to follow along with them because they're so distracting. And again, this is a thing. If you're nervous, you may use more vocalized pauses. If you're not as prepared or didn't practice as enough times as you want to, you're giving yourself a moment to try and figure out what you're going to say next. And so that's why we use those vocalized pauses. So sometimes it's just good to remind ourselves it's okay to have quiet, right? It's okay just to be quiet, let the audience take in the information that you just said, and then you come back with your speech, right? It's okay, right? Audience ain't gonna know. Oh, that's a big pause. It's time for them to take in the information. So allow yourself to be quiet and pause if you need to refine your place or figure out what exactly you want to say next, which is common in extemporaneous speaking, to have those pauses. Then there's the vocal projection. So how well we're projecting. Again, I talked about if you're being in a big audience, you need to make sure you're projecting well. So it says actors use a lot of time with those vocal warm-ups. Singers do a lot of those as well, just to make sure that message is conveyed. So look how big your audience is and make sure the person in the back of the room is going to be able to hear you well. So again, using definitely a big voice in order to talk. But even if I'm sitting here talking to a camera, I have some vocal variation, and I want to make sure I'm projecting, so you don't have to turn up your volume all the way and then kind of listen and have trouble hearing it. So I want to make sure, again, maybe the microphones are working well. So there's, you're projecting well with the microphone. Sometimes I'll project and I'm having a microphone and then it gets too loud. So maybe I need to be quiet if I'm using a microphone. So figuring out the right projection for that microphone or for the technology, it could work, is something to consider as well. So many nonverbal aspects of delivery. So looking at the personal appearance, I'm wearing a shirt with a collar on it, right? That's what I do to look halfway professional. This isn't how I wear just my everyday life. I try and dress up a little bit for teaching, but it's not too formal either, right? I don't wear a whole suit and tie. Sometimes if you're speech and debate, people do care a lot about that, suit and tie. or very much, very formal dress because it can help boost your credibility. For me, I'm not too picky about it with my students. So what they're wearing, I'm not going to sit here and pick apart their appearance. I think there's some classist notions there. I come from a blue collar family. I don't wear a suit at my wedding, right? That's just, so I think there's some class notions that, what looks nice or what doesn't look nice or what's considered professional, what's not considered professional. But certainly, talks about men using a button-down shirt or shirt with a collar on it and casual dress pants. For women, it might be, kind of a blouse, a shirt, something neutral tones. So I'm wearing red. That's a Ridgewater color. That's college, so I'm going to wear the college color. But sometimes those kind of blacks or dark blues, navies are often recommended. Nothing too bright or eccentric. If you have long hair, make sure you have your kind of hair upright because sometimes it can be distracting if people are constantly playing with their hair. So again, figure out what works well there. It also says, think of this as an interview. You want to make a good first impression for your audience. So dress appropriately for the situation. So I have some tips on here on what to wear and what not to wear. Again, I'm not super picky as an instructor. I'm from a blue collar family. I think some of this is classist to what's viewed as, appropriate or not appropriate. But there are people who aren't going to be me and your audience, when you're giving a speech, who may have these perceptions and may say, hey, you need to be more formal. Sometimes I've been told I dress too casually, as in, oh, you're instructor, you teach a college, you should dress up more, right? You shouldn't be so casual. But it's like, this is dressing up for me, so I'm going to be who I am. And that's kind of how I approach it. But certainly there are people with other opinions as well. And then there's movements and gestures. So like I was saying, my clothes, I was using my hands as a hand movement to gesture to myself. The facial expressions that we use, if we're smiling, if we're frowning, whatever it may be, those facial expressions can, have an impact on, how people are interpreting what you're saying. Sometimes people will fidget a lot and that can get distracting as well, or step back and forth or pace around. So again, trying to keep your place is important. Sometimes I like standing behind a podium or next to the podium if I want to kind of be in the audience a little bit more. That's how I prefer to present. But certainly there's a lot of other ways too. I know formal speech and debate, I've judged some speech and debate. They'll like stand in the middle, then they'll go over here, then they'll go over here, then they'll go back here at the different parts of their speech. So that's like a triangle that they make. So they have specific places and they're very thoughtful about where they're going to move around. So some people are very thoughtful about, oh, I'm going to use this gesture here. Here's the facial expression. Here's the tone I'm going to have. Here's my body stance. I have bad body posture. So sometimes, do you have good body posture? Are you standing up to have confidence? So that's something to think about as well. They've also done some research about your body posture can help you feel more confident if you have more positive body posture. So really opening yourself up and doing some power stances before giving a speech. That can be helpful in making you feel more confident going into the speech. So it talks a little bit about different facial expressions. Certainly can read through that. Eye contact. So there's some eye contact failures, head bobber. There's actually some people with medical conditions that their head bobs a little bit. I've been told I do that. I don't know that I do that, but just I do more of a slight bob. But bobbing, looking up and down on your notes is more of what this is talking about. That can be distracting. You want to know your speech well enough so you can step away from your notes, is what I say. Step away from your notes and look at the audience. So you don't want too many notes. A balcony gazer who looks over the heads of the audience to avoid any individual. So sometimes it's just good to make eye contact with individuals and your audience and be there in the moment and connect with them. The obsessor, the person who only looks at one or two audience members or only looks in one direction. So often when I'm, again, in a classroom and I'm the instructor, they'll often look at me, right? They'll look at me and, oh, you're the one grading me, so you're the audience that I care about. And the rest of the people are your audience as well. So make sure to look at your entire audience to engage with them. With technology, sometimes we're going to need to know our Zoom audience, talk to our Zoom audience. We may have other people who are live and in person. So you're going to need to balance those hybrid approaches, making eye contact with the camera, also the rest of the audience, so everybody feels included in that instance. Mastering the location. So the room, kind of get there early, check out the room, see if there's a podium, see where the audience is going to be seated. This also helps with how much am I going to need to project? Is the technology working? But even when I'm making a video right now, I'm making a video. I intentionally came to my office to make this video because it looks more professional than my office at home where I'm just in my basement. Right. So again, what's our background look like? I have this colorful picture back here. A lot of people find it intriguing. I have more colors over here. So it's not completely plain. I have a couple of degrees on the wall to show my credibility as well. So I'm really thoughtful about, the location. This isn't perfect, right? This is nowhere near perfect fancy video. But again, I did put some thought into my background and how I'm framing the video and how I'm approaching it. So the podium, if you have note cards, you can set the note or any sort of notes. Sometimes I'll print out an outline. I prefer speaking from a speaking outline than using note cards because note cards can get out of order. Whereas a speaking outline, I can just go and kind of check things off. So that's how I present. But people have different preferences on how they use their notes, but those notes can go on the podium if you have it. If there's the equipment, making sure the technology works. So again, get there early. When I give professional speeches, it's like, okay, is my PowerPoint going to work? Is my clicker to advance the slides going to work? Is the microphone working? Right? Try it out. If you're showing a video, get there early enough to try the video or try the music or whatever it may be, making sure your technology is working. Once I was giving a speech about technology, about social media, at a conference, and the technology just was not working with my laptop. It was not cooperating. I was trying to get videos to play. I was trying to use the PowerPoint. It was a mess, and it was embarrassing. Right? It was embarrassing to have those many issues. I got there early. I got there early to fix it, right? To make sure everything worked. I did not get there early enough though, because the people at the conference who were running the conference weren't able to get to me until like after my session started to help me figure out the technology because my laptop was not compatible with their system. So I got there like 15 minutes early trying to fiddle around with it. Then I tried to call it for help, and it was throughout the entire session. It was like an hour-long presentation, and I was having issue after issue after issue, and it was a bit of a mess, right? So you want to make sure you get there early enough. And if you're running a conference, if you're sometimes, especially with Zoom, there will be someone just running the technology for you, which I've experienced many times. I've been the person running the technology. I've had people run the technology for me. So sometimes it's good to split off those duties if you're running a conference or getting someone to come speak for you, especially in an online format, but even in person. If you're having someone come speak to you, make sure the technology is working, right? That's part of inviting the speakers, making sure technology is working for them. So it's not just the speaker's responsibility, but it's there's a lot of people around the speaker as well. Then the microphone, make sure you're using the microphone well. Sometimes people, pull the microphone here. It's too close, so it gets too much sound, or it's too far away, so you're not even using the microphone really, but you're holding it. So just making sure that microphone works well and working well with your voice. So testing it beforehand can be helpful as well. So it says water. Water is the only liquid that should be provided for a speaker. Whatever, right? I have pop here. I have my Diet Mountain Dew. But if you drink bubbles, then you might burp, right? That's the reason why they don't recommend drinking pop when you're giving a presentation. So drink water, right? Water can be helpful. Just to wet your throat. Water is necessary for the hydration of the vocal cords. So singers and performers really use a lot of that water, taking a sip just to allow themselves to drink the water. And taking a sip of water can also be a good pause. It can pause in the speech for effect. Sometimes comedians will plan out when in their set that they're going to go get a drink of water just to let the audience laugh or sink in the moment a little bit more. So it can be very intentional when you're timing out your water, or if you're just like, hey, I need a drink of water, and I calm myself down and reset, just take that sip of water, allow yourself to have a pause, and then continue on. So preparing notes, I talked earlier that you can use note cards. You want to use enough information on your note cards so you can follow along, but you don't want too much, because if you're doing too much and you're going to be reading, or you can do that head bobbing where you're just kind of looking up quickly and then going back to your notes. So you don't want to be reading the speech for extemporaneous speaking. If you are doing a manuscript, you don't want to read it off note cards either. So again, often we see teleprompters used for that. So that's I assume you don't have a teleprompter sitting in your home. But that's what a lot of people use for that. But sometimes people use technology. So an iPad, I've seen people use their, see, I just burped because I had pop. That's why you don't drink pop when you're giving a presentation. Some people use their iPad or cell phone to use notes. Again, I don't always trust technology to work, so I usually print off an outline, or I'll have a PowerPoint and I'll use the PowerPoint as my notes to remember, okay, what are we doing next? So that can be helpful as well. So again, make sure that the notes are easy enough to follow along with without getting too distracting. Also, if you have a bunch of note cards or multiple pages, make sure you have, sometimes people lose order. They may drop them and then they try and get them back together. Or if they have a front and back, then okay, front, back, and it gets confusing. So just one side of the paper can be helpful, and flipping can be distracting for the audience as well. So just one side of the note cards or one side of the paper, make sure they're numbered, and they can go through them in order. So yeah, often I just print off one page outline, and that's what I'm using for my speech. Or if it's a longer speech, I'll use PowerPoint. So that can be it too. So rehearsing the speech, you should rehearse your speech aloud and ideally with an audience, right? So someone's hearing you and can give you feedback. You can record yourself giving the speech for practice. You could rehearse in front of a mirror. I like recording the speech just because, again, that's something that's been a problem for me, is speaking too fast. So if I record the speech, then I can really listen to myself and say, oh, I'm talking way too fast there. But the problem is when you're giving a speech by yourself, either recording yourself in the mirror or whatever it may be, we often speak at a different kind of pacing that by ourselves than we do with an audience. So audience is the best because it's going to be most realistic. I've had many students, they come in and say, but I've been practicing the speech, I typed it out, I'm going to be within that 4 to 6 minutes. And then they come up there and they're way long. They're like 7.5 minutes because they didn't prepare for everything, right? And sometimes it's even, I didn't practice with my PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint ended up making it take longer. Once when I was in college, I was doing a performance studies class, and so we had to give it's like public speaking, but it's more acting, like between acting and public speaking. But you put together a little performance for the audience, and I didn't use all my props when I was practicing, so I timed it out without the props I was using. And then when I had the props, it took longer, and it just like, oh, right, this was very different using the props. I should have practiced with them because it just impacted the length of the speech. So again, you want to make sure as realistic as possible. If you're using a PowerPoint, practice with a PowerPoint. If you're using notes, practice with those notes that you plan on using. Right. So make the situation as realistic as possible. If you have an audience, if you can practice in the space you'll be presenting your speech, that'd be ideal. But sometimes we're not going to get to that speech location beforehand. But if you can, that's always good. So here's your rehearsal checklist if you want to kind of go through some things that you could do or you could take into account. Then hear about managing stress as well. That's a big part of the delivery, so you don't get too anxious. Speaking in front of a group and public speaking is one of the greatest fears that people have. Fear and stress result in psychological and physical manifestations that can affect a speech. So you may have your muscles tightening, and it may impact your vocal cords. You can be sweating more. You can be getting red in the face. So again, a lot of things that can be going on there. Have some solutions here. Just take a sip of water, just relax in the middle of speech. Beforehand, just kind of, feel confident, help yourself be relaxed, and take some deep breaths. There are a lot of different ways. So, and figure out what works for you, right? Each person's different. So what's going to ease my anxiety may not be what eases your speaking anxiety. I think the biggest thing is practice. And for me, even now, I've given lots of speeches and I still get nervous, especially kind of bigger, more important speeches, I would say, right? Teaching is important, right? But if I'm giving in front of a professional audience, I'm like, oh, these people are going to judge me more, right? Students are a pretty nice audience, actually. So if you're just giving your speech to a group of students, they're usually pretty supportive and a good audience. More of a professional presentation where people are giving out their work day to be there, they can be a little more judgy, right? So that's where I get more worried. Or if you're running a meeting, if you're the boss running the meeting, or if you're just presenting in a meeting, people can be like, oh, is this worth my time? Why do I have to be here, right? They may be forced to be their captive audience, may not appreciate it as much, but students are usually pretty good. They're supportive of one another in order to, hey, you want your peers to be successful because you know how nervous it is getting up there and giving the speech as well. So yeah, figure out what works for you for managing your stress and your speech anxiety. But a lot of things in the moment are just giving yourself a moment to pause, take a sip of water if you have it, or just take a deep breath and continue on with your presentation. Your audience may not even notice you're nervous. I noticed a lot of students say, oh, I was super nervous. Everyone was noticing all these little things I was doing. And I'm like, I didn't notice that at all, right? Often we get in our head. And they say that with actors as well. Oh, I messed up my line there. Well, the audience doesn't know your line, right? The audience doesn't know what you were planning on saying. So they're just going to see, oh, that's what they intended, right? They don't know all the things that you could critique yourself over. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So then when you're actually delivering the speech, just, again, you've rehearsed it, you're prepared, you know what you're going to say, you know how you're going to say it, you've practiced, you've done things to reduce your stress, you've checked out the room, you're kind of arrived early. So it's just about delivery, right? It's about following through with it. And the more speeches you deliver, the better you'll get at delivery. So even if you're not great the first time, you think, oh, I didn't practice enough. Well, guess what? This is going to be practice for your next speech. So in my public speaking class, we have 4 speeches, so we can have practice, right? You're not giving the same speech, but you're going to have practice speaking, so you can get more comfortable, you can get more confident, and you can help kind of smooth out those delivery aspects. So the conclusion here. So the true test for this chapter is the actual presentation of the speech. So we can read the chapter all we want. We can talk about it all we want. But the biggest thing here is practice, right? Getting out there, giving speeches, and more opportunities you have to speak, more opportunities you have to practice, and the variation in the situations. So talking, giving it to your friends and family, giving it to a classroom audience, giving it and at work, as many different variations in where you can give your speech is going to help you feel more confident in more situations as well, and feel more confident in public speaking overall. So I hope you found this information helpful about delivery. Good luck with your speeches. Again, practice makes perfect. So take some of these tips to practice when you're practicing beforehand for that delivery, and then it's going to help improve your final product when you're actually giving that live presentation. So thank you for listening. Take care. And always reach out if there's anything else I can do to help.